What about the flying poet?
Yeah, no, I've got to make some announcements, so I was just giving them another minute or so.
Oh no, they said not to, just go.
Okay,
Yeah.
righto. Te mata moa au me tēnei whakataua ki ngā Ngāti Porou. Iti te kōpara, iti te mokoroa. Ka hinga te rākau nui o te wā nui a tāne. Welcome. I'd like to begin this part of our afternoon with a Māori proverb. It goes like this. Iti te kōpara, iti te mokoroa, ka hinga te wā nui a tāne. That means the bellbird or the boa is small, but by these things the great forests of Tāne are filled. In other words, little things can accomplish much. Some good things, some bad things, who knows? Why I'm saying this is for many reasons. What recording I've heard about the struggles facing librarians. Remember, iti te kōpara, iti te mokoro, ka hinga te wā nui a Tāne. The bellbird and the boa bring down the great forest of Tāne. Now, I was asked by someone, and this somehow all fits in, just to briefly mention that some people find it hard to listen to the keynote speakers if people are whispering and talking while the speakers are speaking. Now, I know that sometimes when the speakers speak, they say something and you start talking about it to the mate sitting beside you. If we can just try and keep that in balance. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to introduce the chairperson, Megan Clark.
Kia ora everyone. Ko Megan, whoops. Don't worry about that. Ko Megan Clark aho. It is my very great pleasure today to welcome our keynote speaker, Andrew Booth. The Health SIG have been squirreling away funds for many years with the view to bringing Andrew here to talk with you this year at conference, and we are so proud and so pleased that he is here and willing to share his experience and his expertise. Andrew Booth is a librarian. He trained as a librarian in Aberystwyth, and he's worked predominantly in health librarianship. But his recent areas in evidence-based librarianship, whilst based on some of the evidence-based practice in the healthcare, has had cross-librarianship ideas that we've all been able to benefit from, particularly those of you who came to the workshop on Saturday. You will see from your program that he has had many years and has been a very prolific writer in terms of health information. Just this year, Andrew was awarded the Cyril Barnard Prize for Outstanding Contribution to Health Librarianship in July 2011. And so it is with great pleasure that I invite Andrew to speak with you today and share some of the experience that his research has gained over the years. Andrew.
Kia ora. Thanks to the Health SIG and to the organising committee for inviting me here. For those of you who don't know, England is a small country to the east of Wales. Its national pastimes are marrying royalty, being videoed in nightclubs, and as Martin reminded us, jumping off ferries. There's no recent evidence of a rugby team, although allegedly a loose confederation of Englishmen did provide France with a light training workout prior to their inevitable defeat by the All Blacks. I come from Sheffield, and it's a city in close proximity of the Pennines, known as the backbone of England. So if you were to stick a pin into Sheffield, you'd likely to achieve some measure of acupunctural relief. It's the fifth largest city. It's known as the Steel City. That's a bit unfair. We're also known to beg, borrow, or cadge. And we spend much of our time in recreation in the beautiful Peak District that Martin shared with you, those photographs of Derbyshire. Well, what I'm going to do today is cover some of the key themes of the conference so far: the passion, the profession. I'm going to talk about the role of evidence-based library and information practice, and then I'm going to hint at some current developments and future directions. I must say at this point that LIANZA, in fact, was the very first international conference that I attended to speak about evidence-based librarianship. That was back in 2001, and I also ran a workshop. You're obviously very forgiving for here 11 years later. You've invited me back, so thank you very much for that. We've had a lot of discussion of passion, and it's come through in what people have said. Not many of the keynote speakers have declared a passion, but when I was at Aberystwyth, I had a passion, and it was that passion for books. But we were told you should never say, if you're going to be a librarian, that you have a passion for books. You have to say that you've got a passion for people. And so for many years, myself and my generation were spelling books P-E-O-P-L-E. And that was a sort of search and replace that we did on our CVs. But when we're talking about passion, well, what sort of passions do we have? I was very gratified to see that a new professional, someone who'd graduated recently, put on their blog, before they hadn't got a job yet. And it's very important to distinguish between what we do as part of our job and what we do as a profession. They hadn't got a job yet, but they declared their passion for sharing information, for helping to connect people to the information that they need. And of course, these are passions that have come across very strongly at this conference. But I'd like to get you to entertain what I might say a more mature passion, a passion as we get on in our profession, a passion for continually monitoring, for evaluating, and of course improving our practice. And we do that by engaging with research as both a consumer of research, and I've had the privilege of just sitting through 2 excellent research sessions here in this auditorium, as producers of research. And this is perhaps a helpful way of thinking it. For many years, as we enter the profession, we engage with the bottom left-hand quadrant, the quadrant of practice, and we develop our expertise in that particular practice. But as we start to be critical about what we do, we perhaps think, well, I've been doing this for years, is this the best way? Is there an alternative way of achieving an equal or better outcome? Then we really want to move into the right-hand quadrants. We want to move into the quadrant of practice-based research. In other words, we want to be engaging with the research as both a consumer and a producer. And the theme of today's presentation, research-based practice. We want to be using research, but also collecting our own data, in fact, researching our own services. And one of the things that I hope that you'll take away from this particular session is when we're talking about evidence, we're not just talking about that gets into peer-reviewed journals. We're talking about locally collected data. We're talking about the views of your users. We're talking about the expertise of your staff. And that will come through later as well. I'm going to deal with a few myths as well, and the first of those is that, yes, EBLIP, Evidence-Based Library and Information Practice, perhaps has this reputation. It's a sort of cold fish, isn't it? It's about being scientific and rational, and it's almost an opposite, an antipathy to the idea of passion. And I want to get away from that idea because within evidence-based library and information practice, and certainly this was the case for the conference that we hosted in Salford this year, initiative and enthusiasm is a major driver. And so that's really where my title comes from, the idea of harnessing the initiatives and enthusiasms that are associated with passion to the mechanisms and tools of evidence-based practice. Now, I don't know if you've ever Googled yourself. It's the sort of thing that we don't really confess to, isn't it? It's one of these private things that we do. But in preparation for this presentation, I Googled myself, purely in the interest of research. I wanted to see, obviously I have some disadvantages. I'm male, I'm Anglo-Saxon, and I'm a librarian, so I didn't imagine there would be anything there on passion linked with my name. Above all, in doing this research, I just hoped my wife didn't walk in to the room at the time I was doing it. But I was actually surprised to be reminded in a publication available on the web. This is from the Joanna Briggs newsletter. And this was nice, not on a personal note, but for the fact that it demonstrates that you can actually have a passion for evidence-based library and information practice. So far from being an antipathy, far from being an opposite to the idea of passion, evidence-based library and information practice is something that all of us can cultivate a passion about. And we haven't really said during the course of this conference, we haven't really said that passion is also a two-edged word. It has a dangerous side to it. And for us as librarians, passion does hold a danger. For many library staff, being right is a passion, being the oracle. There are, as mentioned here, the idea that we're championing our users, and we always say that our users are first and foremost in making our decisions, and yet we have this clashing together of our users' perceptions, what their expectations are, and our attempts to impose our own scientific rationality, if you like, by making them do this thing called information literacy. And certainly, I don't know how many users you've asked, would you like some information literacy, but I would be very surprised if they actually respond in a positive manner. And this brings us to myth number 2, the librarian always knows best, which I've also known as the divine right of librarians. And we have to be very careful about this. Yes, over the years we have developed good knowledge of our communities, but we should never take for granted that we have an understanding of them. We should try as much as possible to put ourselves into their skin. And so I'd just like to raise this question, when we're looking at our services, do we in fact attune to the real genuine needs of our users, or does our passion actually cloud our view? And I just want to share some research. Many of you will have seen this because Sue McKnight, after being a great asset both to the UK and to the evidence-based community, obviously returned to this hemisphere, firstly to Canterbury. And this was some work that she did while at Nottingham Trent University. And what this emphasises, and her work on the customer value discovery chain was really important, but this was what really took me, is that if you look at here, you've got the white bars, which are what the library staff thought, and the red bars, which are what the students thought. And so you can see in some areas, yes, there is a match between the two sets of expectations. These were around so-called irritants in the library services. But on other areas, there are complete mismatches. So, for example, the staff observers overrated how much of an irritant the difficulties with printing and photocopying would be compared with the students. Whereas what was really concerned the students, and only just over 60% of the staff recognised this, was materials not being where they're supposed to be. So this really emphasised to me that we have to be very cautious about the danger of thinking we know what our users want. And this ties in nicely with some work done in the evidence-based library and information practice field around cognitive biases. Those biases, those rose-tinted glasses, if you like, that get in our way when we make decisions. And here's a few that you might recognise from perhaps your own staff meetings, from your own behaviour, from that of your colleagues. Primacy effects. When we see information first, we attach more importance to it, and it's harder to rid from our mind than information that comes later along. And then there's the reverse of that, recency effects. The idea that something that we've encountered and has that novelty value that's very new in our mind, that itself is harder to put into the overall perspective. And so we attach too much importance to that. Stereotype, well, that's perhaps one that we're very familiar with. all librarians form rigid perceptions. No, that was stereotyping. No, we form rigid perceptions based upon incomplete information, and we've seen some dangers of that. I particularly welcomed the idea that's been a theme in this conference about a greater understanding between the two partners in this particular nation, for example, and stereotype, of course, is a big barrier to advancing there. Perseverance of belief. That's where we cling to a belief like a life raft, even when that belief has been discredited, when it's no longer valid. And then, of course, that idea of filtering, selective perception, where we filter according to a situation, and we don't really take advantage of facts in challenging those beliefs or prior expectations. I'm sure you can see where we're going here, that passion is important. Passion is something that we need in order to give us direction. At the same time, we shouldn't let our passion be coloured or determined by some of these cognitive biases, some of these prejudices that all of us hold. And we all suffer from question framing bias, don't we? Well, as you can recognise, that was an example of question framing bias. That's that we can cause a decision to be directed by the way that the question has been phrased. And of course, we probably see this in its worst form, don't we, with our dreaded user evaluation forms, when we write the question to get the answer that we want without really realising that we've fallen into that trap. So, sort of, how much did you enjoy the library training session? If we'd used a word like endure instead, then we might get a different reaction. And it was interesting that in taking forward this work, my counterpart, Jonathan Eldridge, over in the US, he identified that there's two primary cognitive biases that librarians confess to. This wasn't an outsider sort of trying to make a judgment, but just he asked librarians to try and identify the biases that they fall into. And one of those is the status quo. Not anything to do with the rock group, but preferring things as they are. And this one, I thought I'd have enough trouble pronouncing the Mari, but I'm going to have trouble with the French now. Déformation professionnelle, no, not even close. But that's seeing the world through the eyes and biases of one's own profession. And that really rings true, doesn't it? That we do, as part of our passion for our profession, we do start to form a worldview that is based upon our profession. Don't look at this for too long, please, because it makes your eyes go funny. But yes, it's attractive, provocative, profoundly disturbing. Enough of me. Let's go on. I want to show you the verbal equivalent of this. And this is just a little caution to those of you who've espoused the information literacy cause. Here's someone in research saying that not having information skills training can be good because you have to learn the hard way. You tend to have better skills if you've had to find your own way around, but it would have been nice to have been eased into it in a bit more structured way as well. Now, I'm not saying that this is your average finding. I'm just saying that sometimes, as with the picture that we just glanced at, perhaps with our mirror so that we didn't sort of turn to stone or whatever, that sometimes we just need to think a bit more about some of the assumptions that we have. One of the things that I've said in talking about evidence-based information literacy is that our information literacy courses are very often based around an average. Our evaluations are based around an average. Now, averages are very dangerous things. An average would be that we're giving half the people too much information and half the people too little information, but we're still doing well on average. Now, obviously, that's not the sort of situation we want, but we have to be aware of these sort of outliers, these sort of opinions, and these are an opportunity for us to reflect, to examine our practice, and this is the sort of evidence that we ought to factor in to help guide our passions. And Just having targeted information literacy, to target another area here. When I was at Aberystwyth as a library student, we were told about the two types of dictionary that there was. There's the prescriptive dictionary, and it was sort of told you how you should use a word, and there's the descriptive dictionary, which tells you how people actually do use the word. And I think there's a danger of that with our training as well, that if we have this divine right of librarians where we think that there is a right way of searching and that our target is to get our users, our students, our school children to use that right way of searching, then that is the prescriptive approach. Just want us to entertain the idea that we might be better off or more usefully employed by finding out more about how our users do search at the moment and try and help them to harness what skills they've got. And just as an example here, this isn't an area that I've really evaluated, but it's a suspicion I have. If you type a medical-related topic into Google, the dreaded Google, the one that gets trashed at every library conference I've ever been to, if you type a medical-related concept, invariably you will get a PubMed abstract on page 1 of the results. And from that PubMed abstract, you can link to related articles, you can link to articles citing that. Are we right to assume, and as I say, this isn't an area that I've gathered evidence, but are we right to assume that following that approach of finding an abstract, following up cited references or related articles is actually a less effective way than the primitive technologies of Boolean logic and subject headings? Shall I leave now? But I'm just getting you to entertain that thought. And this is what the danger of the divine right of librarians. And certainly this would be a fascinating area to look at. Would we be better employed in getting people to harness the tools that they'd be using anyway better, or do we have to get them to migrate them to the proper tools, the right way of searching? So what I'd like us to carry forward from this stage of the discussion, the fact that evidence-based practice can be an antidote to wrong passions and to this thing called cognitive bias that clouds our decision-making, that can perhaps keep us in a rut. And what we can do, though, is harness our passions and evidence-based practice together. And that's going to be very much the theme of the rest of this presentation. And in support of that, some lovely work done in Queensland by Helen Partridge. Many of you may well know her. And she was interviewing librarians and talking about, well, what's attracting you to evidence-based library and information practice? And here we have one saying, well, I'm very passionate about things, so I made sure that I had something to back up my passion. And so that's how I'd like us to think of evidence-based library and information practice, the way of backing up your passion. And the same informant went on to say that being able to prove what we do in libraries or how it's done in libraries or why we do things or how we do things, but be able to prove that by either statistics or an understanding of what's been done before. And that brings us to the next theme, the profession. What's the difference between these? We've got the barber's shop there, and then we've got all these lovely surgical instruments that none of us want to encounter at close proximity. And this brings us to myth number 3, the idea that we don't need to be a research-based profession, that we're just good at what we do, and that's enough. And here's the contrast from those pictures, the idea of the barber versus the surgeon. And of course the tradition of the barber, as our speaker from Wales, Andrew, attested to, goes back to time immemorial. He probably got one of the early ones. Long before there was history, there were razor blades found among the relics of the Bronze Age. In comparison, the profession of surgery, comparatively recent origin. Now, superficially, they're very similar, aren't they? You know, you get a knife, you've got something you want to achieve, and you intervene. But I'm sure that you're already thinking which of those you would rather have operating upon you. And when you think about it, what's the difference then between a barber and a surgeon? Well, one of the things, and in the UK we have a Royal College of Surgeons. I know you have colleges and institutions, surgery in Australia, New Zealand, etc. It's about building up and transmitting an evolving body of knowledge. And so that's something barbers don't do. Barbers essentially are using the same techniques. They may use electric-powered tools now, but essentially they haven't built up and transmitted an evolving body of knowledge. And if you think about it, the surgeon does this through reflective practice. And you can sort of think of the difference, the sort of what we might call the oops factor. So a barber makes a mistake, oops, and then just ushers the person out of the building, or diverts the remains of their body to a pie if you're in London. A surgeon, of course, goes oops, and then they debrief. They think, what should I have done differently? What could I have done? How do I compare with my peers? And I'll just use this for a slight digression. I'm not going to have many digressions, but just a slight digression where I want to emphasise the importance of the right evidence in the right context. And it's something that I tell our students in health informatics in their early days of the course. So just imagine a patient sort of coming round after the anaesthetic, and the surgeon leans over and says, Mr. Jones, I've got some very bad news for you. Instead of cutting your left leg off, I've cut your right leg off. And the patient goes hysterical, screaming and tearing at the bedclothes. And he says, the surgeon says, Come, Mr. Jones, it's not that bad. There's many people who've got through life with only one leg. And he says, yes, but I'm not Mr. Jones. But the point there is about bringing together the evidence and the context. And certainly one of the things that worries me about the evidence-based practice movement, not just in librarianship, but in health, is its misuse. It's cutting off the wrong leg, if you like, can be a very dangerous thing. So that's just a little word of caution there, that we have to use the right tools along with reflective practice in the right setting. And so the question for us to reflect on, will we as librarians continue as barbers just acquiring the same inventory of skills and repeating the same practices, or will we build up this body based on reflection and communicate it to others? And as I say, I really enjoyed the sessions prior to this one, where there was some eloquent communication of some of the projects that are taking place in this country and in Australia. And so one of the conclusions here, if research is absent, non-existent or even scarce, there is no profession, but only an occupation grounded in techniques, routine and common sense. And that goes back, doesn't it, to what we were saying earlier, the importance of it not just being our day job, but of course of it being our profession. And research is one of the characteristics of it being a profession. And so this is really just by way of a background then to the whole idea of evidence-based practice. It's founded on the premise that professional practice should be based on up-to-date, valid and reliable research. And that has the effect of us being able to add value to our work practices. And that use of research in practice, so it's not research for research's sake, it's not the ivory tower, but research in practice is a clearly distinguishing mark between those professionals who maintain the status quo, remember that cognitive bias that we said earlier, without question, and those who strive to develop their work practices through continual evaluation and investigation. And so research isn't a bolt-on extra, it isn't something that you do when you become experienced. It's something that's inextricably linked with being a professional. And that's why Harvey, for example, identifies research skills as a prerequisite for us working successfully in information environments. And of course, in the quest to evaluate our services, we dip into the same toolbox, the same toolkit that is required to carry out research. So it has a double benefit, that by developing our skills and experience in evaluation, we're using and becoming familiar with many of the tools that we also need in order to carry out and address research questions. And a nice comment, a nice conclusion by Joanne Marshall, who says that the health and future of any profession depends on the members' ability to evaluate both themselves and their professional practice. And here are some of the benefits that we get of engaging with research. And as we said earlier, this isn't that everyone needs to be able to open the bonnet of the car and actually change the engine. It's some of us just have to be able to get in the car and know how it works. And that's the same with research. We need to be informed consumers of our own evidence base, not necessarily all practitioners. But at the same time, by engaging with research, we can inform practice, we can help see where we ought to be going, not just incrementally moving in a relentless direction. We can raise the profile of the discipline, be surgeons, not barbers. And of course that then has the effect that people know that they're dealing with professionals, that a library and information service isn't something that can be cut when facing difficult situations, but that it is a professional service. Of course, as was attested to by some of the presentations earlier today, research also has benefits at the personal level. It seeks to broaden individual horizons, it offers individual development, it offers the opportunity to look back and think, what would I have done differently? Myth number 4, a lot of criticism has been targeted at evidence-based practice because people say, why evidence-based practice? Why have you focused on this particular mechanism? Isn't it something that's just come from within healthcare and is spreading like a disease to social care, to education, to management? I refer back to an article that was published in the BMJ many years ago, and I've just taken the liberty of translating it to the context of library and information practice. So here are some of the alternatives. If we're not practicing evidence-based library and information practice, what sort of library and information practice would we be practicing? Eminence-based library and information practice. That's the grey-haired sort. So experience trumps all evidence. And I'm sure we still see examples of that within our organisation. Vehemence-based library and information practice, where you increase the volume, you browbeat your colleagues, therefore you're right, and it doesn't matter what the evidence says. Eloquence-based library and information practice. Well, you can see perhaps here the influence of the medical profession. I think we're not so much Armani suits as no money suits, but the point is still there. The idea of it being based on eloquence, the idea of, and this is one of the dangers too of passion, isn't it? That when people speak passionately, they can often stampede you towards a course or direction that on mature reflection you realise was not the right way to go. Then there's providence-based library and information practice. It's where you have no idea what to do and you'll just let things take their natural course. There are a couple more here. Diffidence-based library and information practice. Well, we'll just leave things. I can't change it anyway. Nervousness-based library and information practice, as we see the axe hovering over our service, we just do nothing because we're scared that we'll get the sack or we get sued for doing something wrong. And confidence-based library and information practice, so we just plough on regardless, that bit of bravado. And of course, we don't have to look further than the drug companies to see propaganda-based practice. No doubt there are many services you can identify within our own field that use propaganda-based library and information practice. I thought this ties in very nicely with the theme of this conference and indeed with the particular tack that I've sort of been following here. This was quoted in the Journal of the Medical Library Association, and this commentator, Hill, he said that the flywheel of change and improvement turns ever faster when all of us align our principles, that's the profession part, our passion, which we've talked about several times, and our results or our evidence. And that's where things will work faster, where we'll be able to achieve greater change. So it's taken me quite a while to reach this particular point, but I've dispensed with the alternatives, and what I'd like to do is just spend a bit of time just focusing on the contribution of evidence-based library and information practice. And I'd hate to be misinterpreted that this is just sort of research retreads, if you like, that this is just a way, after us neglecting research for many, many years, it's just a way of putting research back on the agenda, because certainly that's not what attracted me, that's not where my passion for evidence-based practice comes from. It's the idea of using the research, the evidence, to make workplace decisions, to avoid those biases we talked about before. It mentions there, this is again from a blog, that the whole point of evidence-based practice is to avoid reinventing the wheel. Well, actually, Muir Gray, who's a leading proponent of evidence-based practice, evidence-based healthcare, says that there's nothing wrong with reinventing the wheel, it's reinventing the flat tire that you want to avoid. And evidence-based practice is a means for doing that. I'd like you just to pause for reflection and me to pause for breath. Just have a look at these statements here, again from the work done by Helen Partridge. She was interested in the way that people see the relationship between the evidence that you have in your libraries and decisions. I don't know which of these resonates to you about how evidence is for you personally or within your organisation or culture. So there's the idea of the worker bee mentality, which is we just keep beavering away, we hand evidence over to others, and it goes, sort of almost like the papal smoke, and we don't know what's going to happen, we have no say over the final decision. Maybe there's an us and them mentality around the evidence, not being listened to. Maybe there is that optimism, that confidence that if we gather the evidence and present it in the right way, that we will have an influence on the decisions made within our services. Maybe we feel that we've got a bit of political savvy, a bit of nous, so that we can actually influence decision makers to have more of an effect that decisions are going to be made in the direction of the evidence. And then perhaps there's the corporate idea of using evidence, maybe working with networks, with groups, work groups, with colleagues, and influencing decisions in these ways. But it's interesting just to see the whole spectrum with which librarians, to varying degrees, engage or don't engage with use of the evidence. And this is a chance to put the record straight about evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice isn't just about research. It's about integrating three very important ingredients. And we can liken this to a school report. If ever it happens, you get good for maths and you get good for English, but could do better in science. Now, focusing on the could do better in science isn't in any way invalidating the maths and the English. And this is the whole point of the evidence-based practice movement. By saying we need to use research-derived evidence more, we're not underplaying the value of what our users report to us. We're not underplaying the value of what our colleagues and fellow practitioners observe. It's about restoring the balance. It's about offsetting the known deficiency. This diagram here, since I've been in New Zealand, has become known as the trilogy of the rings. But it's the three cogs, the practitioner observed, the user reported, and the research derived, all working in concert, all working together to inform our decision making. And when we think of the opportunities for evidence-based practice, here are some of the contexts. We've had some talk, and certainly the conference is allied with the theme of innovation. Evidence can be just what we need in order to starting. It can also be an excuse for stopping, when we can look round